My name's Pete Behrens, founder of the Agile Leadership Journey. Maybe you saw me speak in the big room, or if you came to our workshop. This is a little bit different. This will just be a talk today, but hopefully engaging for you. But I want you to think about, for just a second, you've been thinking about lean agile procurement. We just saw a whole different policy, process, governance. And as Mirko said, what was the mindset behind that enables that? That's what we do. To me, that's all governance. That's all risk management. That's all financial management. That's all control. Yet, the way they're doing it, the only way to get access to it is to change a mindset. Because who develops the rules? Who develops the governance? Who develops all of those regulations other than governance and stuff that we have to work with the government? But inside of that, we create all the rules. Leaders create all the rules. And so what we think about is, in order to change the rules, you got to change the mindset. So I want to just walk through with you just briefly a little bit about scaling the mindset, which then leads to things like you've just been seeing all day, the policies, the governance, and everything else. But we believe it has to start with a mindset change. A couple things about me. I've mentioned the Agile Leadership Journey. There's one other thing you might want to consider, and that's what we call our Relearning Leadership podcast. We actually had a podcast episode a couple seasons ago now with somebody from an Australian energy company who joined, who shared a similar LAP story. Really beautiful story. Not only for the company, but for her as a leader in that company. What it did for her was really, really powerful. Okay, step number one, all organizations are mindsets. Now, I'm going to share with you just a brief summary. Who came to my workshop yesterday afternoon? Okay, only a subset of you. So for you, you've seen this model, but for the rest of you, I'm going to just share this model. So think of a company. How does it start? The founder, the creator, right? Somebody who has an idea. That company, in order for it to succeed, has to go to market, right? That company has to have sales and marketing, something that's going to deliver something to a customer. Now, for that company to succeed, if they start to sell whatever it is, product, service, they need something to scale. That's where procurement comes in. That's where finance comes in. That's where operations comes in. That's where all of the infrastructure for an organization that keeps it together comes in, right? Scale those systems. And finally, for that organization to be successful over time, we need the connective tissue. Okay, we call this the collaborate. This is the family culture. This is the identity culture. This is where we come together and realize who we are. Now, this is built on a model of values. The values of the founders are about innovation, creativity, autonomy. The sales and marketing is about action, speed, delivery, results. Let's get something done. The value around the scaling is around control. Control's good. Structures are good. I think we even heard that here earlier today. We need structure for agility. Some, too much we learn is bad. But without enough structure, we have chaos. And finally, connection, relationship, values. Don't take a picture yet. We're not done. You're just going to have to delete it. All of these go bad. And my workshop participants learned about how each of these goes bad. How does creativity go bad? Anarchy. Creativity goes bad through anarchy. How does the market action speed go bad? Anyone? Bueller? You guys don't know that. It's an American reference. That was a joke. Toxicity. We're too intense. We focus on stuff too much. We know structure security goes bad because we have bureaucracy. We see a lot of that in LAP, trying to break bureaucracy. And finally, mediocrity goes bad. There's one more before you take a picture. Okay, you can take a picture. Now, the yellow one's kind of interesting. How does a collaborate culture go bad? Actually, we find collaborate cultures aren't willing to challenge others. They're not willing to go into that conflict space you need for healthy change. So collaborate cultures often tend to manage to the middle. We tend to stick with people too long. And that can be unhealthy state too. So what I'm sharing with you is simply just what's called a competing values framework model. It's a model of culture. It's a model of mindset. Culture forms because every organization is a human system. A human system is built on beliefs. So as a company starts, it starts from a founder's point of view, but as a company grows, the culture takes its own personality. And you come into a company, you have a personality, you might assess, hey, I fit one of these, but my company is different than me. And what we're seeing is, like in LAP, right? LAP is addressing companies that are heavily in this control space, right? Procurement. We need to make sure we get the right vendor at the right price, things like that. I don't work with procurement anymore because they're too controlling. They act as a broker to the people who are getting value. They're like a product owner in the middle of my team and my customer. That's what I find most procurement offices, and I think you would say the same. One of the things that I love about LAP is they are taking out the broker and they're bringing the customer and the team together. I would love that. I would love that. Okay, that's just step number one. Every organization is built on mindset. So if that's true, all the policies, all the governance, all the rules in an organization then are built from mindset into those things that we put in place. Now, here's the fun part. Practices and frameworks are recipes. So, somebody tell me, what good are recipes? What do recipes do? The recipes used to cook. Guidance. What else? Standard, repeatable, consistency. They help us cook. I'm not a good cook. I can cook, and a recipe can help me. My problem with recipes usually is I have about 80% of the ingredients, and then you're just like, I don't have that. Let's try this, right? Recipes are great as a starting point. But let's just share a second. Recipes are good to learn, right, when we don't know otherwise. Recipes, though, will not turn you into a 5-star chef. Anybody here a professional chef? Anybody go to chef school? You go to any 5-star restaurant, you go to those chefs. I just went to one. Hugo invited me to one last night. Beautiful restaurant, awesome food. I bet they do not have a recipe for most of their stuff, right? Those chefs are creating recipes, right? Those restaurants are creating their own recipes, and recipes don't scale. And I'm just going to go through this. What does this look like? Let's look at Scrum. Everybody familiar with Scrum? Okay, I used to be a certified Scrum trainer, about 10 years. I don't do it anymore because I find that teaching Scrum will get you so far until you hit the rest of the organization, and then it won't take you anywhere. This is what I see happen with Scrum. Let's apply Scrum to the personality of the company we just talked about. All right, let's talk about the creative Scrum. What does that look like? I call it like the spirit. It's the free spirit Scrum Master or the coach, right? What does this free spirit look like? I don't know when we're going to be done, man. We're agile. Like it's the values. Have you had that? A leader says, hey, when are we going to be done? I don't know. We're agile. Just relax. It's okay, right? You've seen these teams. You've seen these Scrum Masters. They take the spirit of Agile, which is great. It's a principle, but it's like, are we actually going to get stuff? Okay, now let's talk about the pusher, right? What does the pusher Scrum look like? Velocity, velocity, velocity. I need you to pick up your velocity. We're not going fast enough velocity. Can we put a little bit more into that sprint velocity? Anybody feel that in your Scrum teams? Anybody see some of that? Whether it's the leader, whether it's the stakeholders, whether it's the Scrum Master, product owner, whoever that is, we treat Scrum as speed. And that's how it gets interpreted. Now, we also have the authority. I call them the Scrum Nazi. That's not Scrum. It's like, no soup for you, if you watch Seinfeld. No soup for you. Oh, you know Seinfeld. Awesome. One of my favorite shows. That's not Scrum. Follow the rules, right? We have the disciplinarian, right? The person who says, this is Scrum, this isn't Scrum, right? It's the practice person who really gets the process, but kind of forgets about the values. But then we have the friend. What does a friend look like? Like, hey, we're just a team. We can all work on stuff. Everybody can do any kind of job on my Scrum team, right? So what I see happening is we have a recipe, but what do? We all add our own spices. Whoever applies the recipe puts their own spices in it. And so now I go into an organization, I start to scale it. Or if we, by God, we try to get multiple organizations running Scrum, wait a second, that's Scrum? What do you mean by Scrum? All of a sudden, Scrum looks so different in every context because what are we doing? We're adding our mindset to Scrum. So what do I see? I see a flavored Scrum. Now, I'm just picking on Scrum as one way. Now here's an interesting thought. Would anybody put Scrum more squarely into one of these squares than any other? Anybody have an idea? Like it belongs in create, it belongs in collaborate, it belongs in compete or control. Anybody have you would say it belongs in one of those? Control? Yeah, you've been oppressed, haven't you? My team would say that. Scrum, when I first, so this is 20 years ago, I first put Scrum in, my team says, this is micromanagement heaven. Like, I am in a microscope. And people feel that because I was the authority Scrum. Scrum, by definition, these are the values of Scrum. Openness, courage, focus, commitment. There's also respect in there. Those are the values of Scrum. The values of Agile, by the way, individuals' interactions, customer collaboration, responding to change, working software, right? When I look at Agile, when I look at Scrum, when I look at the values, it's a balance. But that's not how it gets applied. Now, I could also say the same thing with the practice and ceremonies. You could put them all in here. Development team, product backlog, sprint planning, product increment, sprint, daily Scrum, sprint review, retrospective. Now, whether you agree with where I put them or not, like, does retrospective really a control thing? I look at it as two things. One is, how do we get better? How do we get more efficient? How do we get more effective? The other could be, right, this continuous improvement, small step change. So Scrum as a practice is neutral. Scrum as a recipe is neutral. But when we humans put our mindset to it, it scales like that. And that's the problem. Now, I pick on Scrum. I think I just said these things. I don't think I need to say anything else on that. But I want to share one more thing. What I'm seeing is the new Scrum. What would you guys say is the new Scrum? What's replacing Scrum as one of the most popular things? Okay, yes, safe. Let's go to the smaller recipes, not the recipe of recipes. Safe's a recipe of recipes. What else is becoming as popular as Scrum? What else are you guys hearing? Kanban? Is it really? I'm not hearing that. This is one I'm hearing, OKRs. I hear OKRs almost more than Scrum today. OKRs. I can do this exact same thing with OKRs. OKRs are a recipe. How do they get applied? Now, just to kind of share what this looks like, first of all, who thinks OKRs come from Google? Good. Oh, we got one. Sorry. Google's popularized the OKR. Who invented the OKR? What's that? Probably somebody that I don't know that you know, Peter. What I've understood, they come from Andy Grove at Intel. Okay. In the 1950s. If you think OKRs are a new thing, think again. History is actually a good thing to learn. It helps us understand. Now, why were they created and what are they doing? Now, what I'm finding interesting is the mindset of OKRs. So OKRs are a great framework. They're a great tool for setting goals and accomplishing goals, and Google uses OKRs all the time, and I've worked with Google quite a bit. But you know the mindset I see with OKRs is this. The expect 100% done, right? So what we see is when I set an objective, you better meet it. Now I see another mindset, right? And so what this does is this shapes a particular type of culture. When I expect 100% done, what is the team going to do? They're going to lower their estimates. They're going to be safe. Not that safe, but the smaller s, safe. They're going to be, I'm going to make sure that I get what I get done. So they're going to be predictable, they're going to be reliable, but they're going to be slower. Now, the 70% rule at Google, on the other hand, if you know about this, anybody know about the 70% rule at Google? A few of you. The rest of you should. If your organizations are using OKRs and you want to be like Google, because they're doing pretty awesome, but they have so much money they don't really care if they're efficient. But they put a different mindset on OKRs. A 70% rule. When I talk to leaders are like, 70%? How do you get reliable, predictable with a 70% rule? Like, 70% means I'm only going to accomplish or expect to accomplish 70% of my OKRs. And leaders look at that and like, that's crazy. That's like, that won't drive predictability. But I'll say, well, that's not their intent. They don't use that recipe to drive predictability. What do they use the recipe for? They use the recipe for it to actually create. They expect their OKRs to change. So the 70% rule actually says, I'm okay as a leader, as a stakeholder, if that OKR actually changes. Now, if all of them are going to change, that's probably a different problem, but I expect a certain amount to change because you're going to learn over this month, because Googlers do it about every month. They do OKRs in every quarter, right? They're setting OKRs on a quarterly basis. So it's okay to change, take a risk. But they add another layer to it. They bring the pusher in this. Google is a pusher. They are pushing their Googlers really hard. It turns into a toxic culture sometimes. But it's also a culture that says, I don't expect you to meet all of these, right? I actually want you to fail. I want you to try more than you are capable of. I want you to stretch yourself. Because you know what? That's going to drive progress. And failure is okay. Now look at this. We have one recipe, OKRs. But I could get the Indian version or I could get the Portuguese version, right? Depends on the spices I add to it. What I'm suggesting here is when you scale a practice, you get all sorts of things. And where it goes and what company is doing it and what organization, even inside your company, is doing, it comes out different. But when you scale a mindset, that can shape all of the practices we have to be better aligned. So OKRs, similar, neutral framework, shaped by the mindset of the leaders. And they'll dramatically differ based on the leadership putting them in place in the organization, especially when we cross organizations. So if you're working cross organizations, both organizations using Scrum, both organizations using OKRs, they may not work together very well. Let me give you an example of this. Before I get to my example, has anybody here seen a recipe that worked for a family or an individual that didn't scale well? Anybody try that? What do we get when we get recipes at scale? I call it airplane food, right? When I think about scaled food, I don't blame the food providers. They have a huge problem, right? How do you get food to be warm at, X height in an airplane 4 hours after you make it to actually taste good? So I don't blame them, right? They have a terrible problem to solve. But we don't always have that problem, yet we apply the same technique. We take a good recipe like Scrum, and when you scale it, it doesn't necessarily turn into the same thing. So SAFe, I would say, is not necessarily bad in and of itself. What they're doing is taking great recipes, Scrum, Kanban, those are great recipes. But they're scaling it in a way that makes the recipe like airplane food. Steve Denning, if you were here Friday, Steve Denning talked about the top 20%, right? Top 20% are not following any recipe. You look at any of these companies, none of them are using a scaling framework. They are all what I would call creating their own recipes. Salesforce, back in 2006, created their own scaling recipe. This was, by the way, before any scaling framework existed. Spotify, SAFe, none of this existed. They scaled. Spotify has become a recipe. Unfortunately, Henrik Nyberg, who helped form the Spotify culture, said, this is not a recipe. This is not a framework. And what do we have today? Dozens of consulting firms using the Spotify model as a recipe to copy. So, yes, your organization can use SAFe, can use Spotify, can use Scrum, any of these scaling frameworks or any of the frameworks in general, but if you really want to become one of the top 20%, you don't get there by following a recipe. You get there by making recipes. So give you an example of this, right? I talked about Salesforce here. Salesforce, when I was working with them about a dozen years ago, so this is a while ago, right? This is before scaling frameworks even existed. We were working with Salesforce R&D, right? That was about 300 people, and they were going through a Scrum transformation, an Agile transformation. They didn't call it Scrum, but we were based on Scrum. And we started with R&D, we moved over into IT, and all of a sudden they said, we're going to buy a company. And this was way before the time Salesforce got really good at buying companies. Now they bought about 50 companies. They've grown huge around the world. But this was like their first or second company they bought back in about 2007-8, right? So I'm dating myself here. And this is what we found when we surveyed the mindsets of these three entities. So when you talk about scaling across organizations, Salesforce was trying to do this. Now, for them, organization looked like R&D. That's what we call the competitive culture. They live in Silicon Valley. It's go, go, go. It's internal competition. We get stuff done, right? That's the R&D culture. That's where their Scrum started. We worked with IT. It was fascinating when we went with IT. You would think IT belongs in control. And that's where a lot of IT organizations live. Fascinating, though, yes, you can have a lot of policy, but their IT organization actually biased on the create side. It was really fascinating. But we tried to do things with between IT and R&D. Complete failures. Why? I struggled. Why is this happening? Why can't we get these two teams working together well? They're both doing Scrum. They're both applying this until we started to get this picture. And then it was like, we have completely different views about what's valuable. We have views about the fighting between creativity, innovation, autonomy to speed and action. And then at that same time, we're working in that challenge, boom, boom, we bought a company, let's just merge them in. And so we did a survey of that company, and look where they came out. This was only a 40-person company, completely dominated hierarchically. The leader controlled everything. So what was fascinating, we actually did a offsite, and we worked with them. About 120 leaders, we got into a big room for 2 days, kind of like big room planning, but for them it was all internal. And we started to share this data, and they started to self-reflect on why and how they became this, and why they value what they value. And what was interesting, before we went into this offsite, the leaders who were trying to pull this all together said, we believe that it'll take about 3 months to merge all this together. After that weekend, the leaders came back and said, let's recalibrate. We think that'll take about a year to calibrate all this together. A year later, they were still calibrating. It took 3 years. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't get progress, they didn't get effectiveness in those first first couple years. What it meant was mindset's a hard thing to change. We can change a process, but all I'm going to do is put my mindset on it. But when you start to change the mindset, whatever process we put in there will get that flavor. So my recommendation to you is start with the mindset. Start with thinking about how do we need to be thinking differently that's then going to help them create the things that you've been talking about all day today. These lean agile procurement governance policies, they will not take place. They will not even get light of day conversation. The conversations we just saw, the presenter there, he would not overcome some of that without a mindset change. So, what did we learn? We can scale things. We're pretty good at it. Processes, tools, technologies, things like that. Oh, look at that. Font is really funky. I didn't mean for those to be small. But what we failed to scale is the human. I believe we got to be better at human scaling, mindset scaling, alignment scaling, not just process tools, technology scaling. Ken Schwaber, when he started Scrum, says the problem is not technology, it's people. Scrum was a people process. And the problem is we've scaled the processes, but SAFe doesn't scale the mindset. Scrum at Scale isn't scaling the mindset. They're attacking it in different ways. I'm not saying they're bad. They're just starting points. So just treat them as that. Don't treat them as gospel. Don't treat them as the only answer. They're a piece of that overall answer. So thank you. Do we have time for one or two questions, or are we about closed up?
Let's go for two.
Two questions. Two questions. Thank you. Do we have two questions? I know it's late. Thank you for your attention. We got one over here.
So thank you for drawing attention to the history. So if you see the history of Google, Microsoft, and Volkswagen, or any automotive company, so how they started, they didn't have any mindset framework, they didn't have any Scrum, Safe, or anything, even though they perform very well. So you now see if you have invested good money, there you might be getting like more than 100x for sure. Now suddenly why in 2022, 23, we need a coach to understand mindset, or maybe we need to understand how Scrum Agile works. Why it is?
You know, a lot of these concepts have been around for about 60 plus years. I mean, you go back to Lean, and you even think about, you know, Toyota did all sorts of this stuff in Lean. Others tried to copy that process and failed. I think we're still learning lessons of servant leadership from the 1960s and things like that. I think the human is immune to change. I think the human is just evolving slower than the rest of technology and everything else. I think these messages are just constant reminders that we as humans need to start changing. And the problem is we're creating bots now and AI based on our brains today. And that's pretty scary. I mean, we've all seen those studies where we put a bot onto Twitter and it turns into some totally bigoted, you know, narcissist or something, and it's crazy. So I think our AI is going to start taking over a mindset that we're plugging. Why? We're humans, we're complex. I think this is a story we got to repeat. I think people learn based on their own failures, not through somebody else's failures. So sometimes I think we just have to fail. One more question, and we'll close out.
The categorization you use are quite similar to the disk model, not just the color,
Sure.
but the meaning of the color.
Yeah.
Is it similar?
Nope. So the question is the relationship between what I showed you and the disk model. So from the concept of personality, yes. Organizations have personality. They develop because we're human systems. The fact that the colors might have aligned to disk, no correlation. The fact that there might be similar kind of things, totally, because the research is based on the fact of how humans focus their values, systems, and things like that. So yes, there is correlation there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete.